Welcome back, everyone, to ABA Chapter Chat. We're going deep today on helping people overcome their fears using ABA.
It's really fascinating how ABA helps break down these really complex emotions into parts we can work with.
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely something that we all see in our work.
Oh, absolutely.
So before we get too far, I was looking at a couple cases. Krisha, who has a fear of public speaking, and then Allison, who has a pretty severe spider phobia.
Yeah, and that's such a good example because it's not just like they're a little nervous. It's like it's really impacting their lives.
Exactly. And I think that's where understanding the two parts of fear in ABA terms is really crucial.
Yeah, so first you have what we call respondent behavior. So you can kind of think of this as like your body's alarm system going off.
Okay, so like a physical reaction.
Exactly. So you see a spider and your heart starts racing, your palms get sweaty.
Like Trisha just thinking about giving a presentation and she starts feeling shaky and she can't catch her breath.
Yeah, exactly. And that's all happening even before she's actually in front of an audience.
Yeah.
So that's respondent behavior. But then there's also what we call operant behavior, which is basically what you do because of that fear.
Like how you try to get away from it or avoid it.
Exactly. So for Trisha, that might be turning down a promotion that involves public speaking. Or for Allison, it might be refusing to go into the basement because she might see a spider.
So it's not just the feeling, it's the actions you take to try to prevent the feeling.
Exactly. And that avoidance, it really just strengthens the grip of that fear.
So then all those relaxation techniques that we often use in ABA, those become even more important.
Absolutely, because it's not just about feeling calmer. It's really about changing how our body reacts in those moments.
I was reading through the materials for today, and it's interesting to me how all four techniques that they mentioned, progressive muscle relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing, attention-focusing exercises, and even behavioral relaxation training. They all seem to target like muscle tension, breathing, and focus. It's like they're all connected.
Yeah, I think that's such a key insight because when you think about it, fear, it throws all three of those things out of whack.
Yeah, you tense up.
Right. Your muscles tense up, your breathing gets all shallow and rapid, and then your attention is just laser focused on that threat.
Right.
So if you can learn to control those things, you're essentially taking back control from that fear response.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, what about systematic desensitization? Is that where you faced your fears, but in your mind first?
Yes, exactly. And I love this approach because it's so gradual. Instead of just throwing someone into their worst case scenario right away, you create this step-by-step kind of ladder of scary situations, starting with the least anxiety provoking and working your way up.
Okay, so that's where the fear hierarchy comes in.
Right, exactly. So for Trisha, instead of immediately imagining her giving a presentation to a huge conference, you might start with her just picturing herself standing alone in a room, maybe even with the lights off.
So very, very basic, and then working up to the more scary situations.
Exactly. And as she practices those relaxation techniques while visualizing each step, she's essentially retraining her brain to associate calmness with those public speaking scenarios.
So like slowly rewiring the brain.
Yeah, you got it.
Awesome. And then we have in vivo desensitization, which takes it out of her mind and into the real world.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so this is where Allison would have to actually be in the presence of a spider.
Yeah, and that can sound really intense, but again, it's all about gradual exposure. The case study described how Allison's therapist started with her standing 20 feet away from a spider in a jar.
Securely closed jar, right?
Oh, absolutely, securely closed. And she used her relaxation techniques to stay calm. And over time, the therapist helped her, decrease the distance step by step, always making sure that she felt safe and in control.
Okay, so like proving to her brain that nothing bad is happening, even though the spider's getting a little bit closer every time?
Exactly. And sometimes those relaxation techniques aren't enough on their own. So there are other tools that we can use alongside them during in vivo desensitization.
Okay, what else is there?
Well, the source material mention things like positive reinforcement. So, rewarding each step closer to the feared stimulus.
Oh, okay. So like giving Allison a little treat or some praise for every foot closer she gets to the spider.
Exactly. It helps build those positive associations.
So it's like classical and operant conditioning all in one.
Exactly.
Oh, cool.
What else? You can also use distracting activities just to help shift the focus away from the fear, and there's even something called contact desensitization, which involves reassuring physical contact from the therapist.
I've actually never heard of that one. How does that work?
So imagine Allison having her therapist's hand on her shoulder or, holding her hand as she approaches the spider. It's just about creating that extra sense of safety and support while she's facing that fear.
Like a real life anchor to hold on to in those tough moments.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. And it's important to remember, that in vivo, desensitization should always be done with a trained professional, especially with those intense fears. Now, the source material also mentioned a couple of other techniques for overcoming fears, flooding and modeling. Flooding is definitely a more intense approach, I guess you could say.
Oh, yeah.
It involves prolonged exposure to the feared stimulus at full intensity, so kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid all at once.
Whoa, so instead of gradually getting closer to the spider, it's like Allison's just in a room with a spider for a while.
You got it. And it can be really effective, but it definitely requires a lot of expertise, and it should only be used in very specific situations.
I can imagine that would be really hard for some people to handle.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to make sure that the person feels safe and supported throughout the process.
Yeah, like really, really supported.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why this approach is usually done under the guidance of a highly trained professional, someone who can monitor the individual's reactions and intervene if needed.
Okay, so flooding is more like a specialized approach. What about modeling? That sounds a little less intense.
Yeah, modeling can be a great option, especially for children. It's all about learning by watching someone else, interact with the feared stimulus or engage in the feared activity.
So if Allison saw someone else handling a spider really calmly, it might help her realize that it's not as scary as she thinks.
Exactly. It just helps to kind of normalize the experience and reduce that anticipatory anxiety.
Okay, and is that something that you could do in person, or can you also use videos?
Yeah, you can do both. We can use live modeling where the individual observes someone in person, and then there's also video modeling where they watch a recording.
I bet video modeling could be really helpful for like kids who are scared of medical procedures.
Oh, absolutely. Seeing another child calmly going through a procedure, it can make it seem a lot less frightening.
Wow, we've covered so much in this deep dive. Maybe we should take a minute to just kind of recap everything we've talked about.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So we started by talking about how ABA breaks down fear into those two key parts.
Right. Respondent behavior and operant behavior.
So like respondent is that automatic, like, oh, no feeling, and operant is what you do about it.
Exactly.
And then we talked about all those relaxation techniques and how they're not just about feeling zen. It's really about changing how our bodies react in those moments.
And how those relaxation techniques are actually tools.
Yeah, exactly. And we talked about systematic desensitization, where you face your fears, but in your mind first.
Right, starting with those easier steps and working our way up.
And then in vivo desensitization, where we take it into the real world.
Yeah, and using all those extra strategies like positive reinforcement and distracting activities and even contact desensitization.
It's really amazing how many different approaches ABA has to help people overcome their fears.
It really is. But before we move on, I do want to emphasize that these techniques, especially the more intense ones like flooding, they should only be used by trained professionals.
Oh, for sure. We always want to make sure everyone's safe.
Absolutely. Now I'm curious to hear what our listeners are thinking.
Me too. I bet they have some great insights.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with a question to ponder.
Okay.
Think about a fear that you'd like to overcome. How could these ABA principles that we talked about today help you create a plan to conquer it?
That's a great question.
We'd love for you to share your thoughts and experiences with us on social media or with your local ABA chapter. So we've been talking all about how ABA can help us work with people who have fears.
And one of the things that really stood out to me when I was looking at these materials was how important it is to really identify all the triggers that contribute to that fear response. It's not always just the obvious thing.
Right, like with Tricia, her fear of public speaking.
Yeah.
It wasn't just being in front of the audience that was causing anxiety.
Exactly. It was all those thoughts and mental images that she had leading up to it, like anticipating the event.
So like her own thoughts were becoming triggers.
Exactly.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense.
Her thoughts were becoming those conditioned stimuli triggering the same fear response as the actual event.
So that's why those attention-focusing exercises can be so powerful.
Absolutely, because it gives people a way to interrupt that cycle, shift their focus to something more neutral.
It really shows how ABA takes that holistic approach.
Yeah, we're not just trying to change the outward behavior. We're looking at all those thoughts and feelings that are contributing to it.
And it makes our interventions so much more effective.
Right.
Another thing I thought was really interesting was how not every problem that looks like fear is actually rooted in that respondent behavior we talked about.
That's such an important distinction for ABA professionals. You might see a child throwing a tantrum every morning before school saying they're scared to go.
All right.
But a careful functional assessment might reveal that that tantrum is actually being maintained by something else entirely.
Like they've learned that if they throw a fit, they get to stay home and watch cartoons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the fear is kind of a means to an end.
Yeah, it's not the root cause.
Right. And that's why those assessments are so crucial.
Yeah, it's like remembering to consider the simplest explanation first.
Absolutely.
We got to rule those out before we start jumping to conclusions about, phobias and anxiety disorders.
Exactly. And even when we are dealing with true fear, sometimes the original cause of that fear is a mystery. Someone might have a phobia of dogs, but have no memory of ever being bitten or having a negative experience with a dog.
So the fear is real, but we don't know where it came from.
Exactly. And the good news is we don't always need to know the exact cause to effectively treat it.
Okay.
What's crucial is identifying those current triggers and then using the evidence-based techniques we've been talking about, to help the person overcome those fears.
It all comes back to those core principles of ABA.
Right.
Understanding the behavior, pinpointing the triggers, and then applying interventions that address, both the physical and the behavioral components of fear.
I think this deep dive has given our listeners a really solid framework for understanding how to do that.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's applicable to so many different situations, whether they're working with clients who have, very specific phobias or helping people manage those everyday anxieties. These ABA approaches can be so powerful.
Absolutely.
And remember, if you're dealing with a really complex case or a severe case, it's always best to reach out to a qualified ABA practitioner for guidance.
I completely agree. We're all in this together, learning and growing as ABA professionals.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on ABA Chapter Chat for this deep dive into conquering fears with ABA.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it helpful and inspiring.
As you go out and face your own fears or help others overcome theirs, keep those ABA principles in mind.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, keep those conversations going.